Do you believe trauma runs in families like a pattern, or breaks with you?
Your brother's housewarming was so special, Mom said, almost casually, like she was commenting on the weather or asking if I had remembered to buy milk. Her fork scraped lightly against the plate, her tone bright, rehearsed, and tinged with that smug delight she always carried whenever the subject turned to him. Then she leaned back, her eyes glinting with a kind of playful challenge, and asked, "When will you do yours?" It was supposed to be light-hearted, a little nudge, maybe even a setup for her favorite pastime, reminding me that I was perpetually behind. I remember setting my glass down, pressing the rim to the table a second longer than necessary, as if anchoring myself. Inside, the irritation was instant, raw, the kind of sting you feel in your teeth after biting into something too cold. She had no idea how practiced I had become at this act, the smile that never touched my eyes, the shrug that made it seem like I didn't care. For years I let her words slide past me, stacking quietly, one on top of the other, until they formed something heavier than resentment, something closer to contempt. But that night, sitting across from her, I felt the weight of every birthday ignored, every achievement glossed over, every time my life was treated like background noise to the symphony of my brother's. I smiled slowly, deliberately, and said, "Mine was last year. But you weren't invited." Her face dropped instantly. It wasn't just surprise, it was confusion, a kind of frozen disbelief, like she was trying to decide if I was joking or if I had just stabbed her with a truth she couldn't easily dismiss. I let the silence hang there, stretching into something uncomfortable, watching as the smug brightness drained from her expression. For once, she was the one caught without the script, without the quick recovery line, without the ability to turn the spotlight back onto him. The funny thing is, the moment the words left my mouth, I wasn't even sure why I said them out loud. I had held that secret for months, tucked away like a hidden ace in a card game I wasn't even sure I wanted to play. Yet the second her question landed, it was like my entire body refused to swallow one more ounce of her condescension. It wasn't a slip. It wasn't anger bubbling over. It was calm, deliberate, the kind of statement you release when you've already decided you're not playing the same game anymore. She blinked, set her fork down, and said nothing. I could almost hear the calculations spinning in her head. When, how, with whom. The silence around the table was thick, though I doubt anyone else picked up on it the way she and I did. To everyone else, it was just a lull in the conversation, but between us it was a standoff, a small war in the making. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I had just tilted the ground beneath her feet. What no one at that table knew, and what Mom especially couldn't comprehend, was how many times I had imagined this moment in different forms. I had spent years as the afterthought, the second option, the daughter who handled things quietly so the golden boy could shine without interruption. If he sneezed, it was a family event. If I bled, it was not the right time to talk about it. Their lives revolved around him like planets locked in orbit, while I spun out on the edges, trying to build something solid for myself without the benefit of their applause. So when I bought my own house, I didn't tell them. When I signed the papers, I kept the keys tucked in my purse, smiled politely at Sunday dinners, and let them believe I was still struggling in some cramped apartment they could look down on. And when I hosted my housewarming, yes, my own party, my own friends, my own laughter spilling through the rooms, I did it without a single member of my family on the guest list. Not out of spite. Not even out of anger. But because I wanted one night, just one, where I wasn't the shadow of my brother's light, where the focus wasn't dragged away by their familiar script. That night was mine. And she wasn't there. Now, sitting across from her, I realized she finally understood that. She realized she had been cut out of a chapter of my life so important that she could no longer dismiss me as the one who never did anything worth talking about. For the first time, she was confronted with proof that I could live without her applause, that I could build something without her approval, and that I could celebrate without giving her a seat at the table. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She wanted to ask details, I could see it, but her pride wouldn't let her. So she settled on a brittle laugh, the kind you use when you want to pretend you're not rattled. But her eyes betrayed her. She looked smaller in that moment, unsure, almost childlike, and the satisfaction that rolled through me was sharper than I expected. I leaned back, let my smile linger, and said nothing more. Because sometimes silence is the loudest form of revenge. And in that silence, I knew one thing. This was only the beginning. When people talk about favoritism in families, they usually say it with a shrug, as if it were a small tilt of the table rather than the whole floor being built on a slope. But growing up in our house meant learning to keep your balance while the furniture slid toward my brother, meant watching him receive praise for things I was expected to do without applause, meant understanding, even as a kid, that every conversation would eventually bend around to the latest micro-victory in his life, while mine were treated as administrative updates, and if I wanted anyone to remember that I existed, I had to carry the weight of proof in the quiet places, report cards folded into drawers, scholarships framed and hung in my first apartment, tax returns filed on my own with no one marveling that I figured it out, all while the spotlight on him stayed warm and ready like a porch light that never turned off. I can map the whole thing through holidays because that is where the slope becomes a hillside. Thanksgiving meant I cooked and cleaned while my mother took photos of my brother carving the turkey like he was a decorated surgeon performing a complicated, heroic procedure, and Christmas meant arranging travel, buying gifts, and smoothing the way for one more spectacular entrance from a man who could not remember the names of his own cousins, and Mother's Day meant I picked a restaurant she would like, drove her there, convinced her to order dessert because she always pretended she shouldn't, and watched him appear late with flowers he had bought at the gas station, flowers she would find charming because she wanted to find them charming. And all of this would have felt like standard family friction if it didn't carry an extra layer of condescension, a glaze of certainty that my role was to facilitate the show, not to headline it. When I left for college on a scholarship I earned by staying up through too many nights with textbooks, coffee, and a stubborn refusal to ask for help that I knew would not come, I did not receive a dramatic send-off or a tearful montage. My mother hugged me at the curb and reminded me to call, then rushed back to help him pack for a weekend trip with friends, because he had never learned the difference between a carry-on and checked baggage, and apparently that was a family emergency, so I learned to do two things very well. I learned to work without applause, and I learned to be interesting only to people who actually liked me. Years later, when my career began to stick and the paychecks stopped making me laugh bitterly, I realized that secrecy can be a bomb, that keeping parts of your life away from people who try to shrink them is a quiet kind of freedom. And that revelation didn't come with fireworks or a manifesto because I am not the performative type. It came with a series of small, deliberate choices like renting apartments without offering addresses, like accepting promotions without group texts, like furnishing a life that felt like a home even before I had the deed. So by the time I stood in a bank office and signed for the house I had picked, modest but crisp, with a yard that looked like possibility and a kitchen that felt like future dinners with people who knew how to bring their own plates, I knew I would celebrate it on my terms or not at all. The night of my housewarming there were candles flickering in mismatched holders because my friends are charming thieves of flea markets. There was music from a playlist that zigzagged through decades because nostalgia tastes better when you're choosing it. And there were shoes piled by the door like evidence that people had come because they wanted to, and I walked through rooms where laughter didn't compete with criticism, and I felt a strange, almost weightless satisfaction, the kind that makes you understand why people keep secrets not out of pettiness, but out of self-preservation. I didn't send photos to the family group chat. I didn't post anything that would be fed back to my mother by one of her tireless informants. And when a friend suggested we take a group picture on the porch under the porch light, I said yes. Then later I saved it with a file name that made me smile, because naming your own joy is a kind of power. It sounds petty if you squint at it, but it wasn't, not to me. Not in a life where every meaningful thing I did was treated like a warm-up for his next act, and the proof that it mattered came later. At a brunch where my mother casually floated the housewarming question across the table like a small test she assumed I would fail, and I decided not to, when I told her my party had happened last year and that she had not been invited. I wasn't trying to wound her so much as to plant a flag in the ground that has always been misty and contested, a line that doesn't need to be shouted to be real. If I am being honest, the decision to start keeping secrets did not arrive fully formed. It grew in layers after a string of tiny humiliations that people pretend do not count because they happen in kitchens and cars and family rooms where everyone shrugs. And one of those humiliations happened the night before my brother's much-praised housewarming when my mother called and asked if I could run point on the catering because he was overwhelmed, which is family code for he forgot to plan, and I said yes because that is muscle memory. Then caught myself halfway through confirming the deposit and realized I was volunteering to be invisible at a party I wasn't excited to attend so the man of the hour could beam while holding sliders he didn't pay for. I hung up, stared at my phone, and felt that familiar burn in my throat that comes from swallowing a grievance because you don't want to be accused of making a scene, and then I did something I had never done before. I wrote a polite email to the caterer explaining that the contact for the event would be changing, supplied my brother's number, and then forwarded the deposit request directly to him with a cheerful note that said, in so many words, "Grown men buy their own napkins." He called me, of course, with the tone he uses when he thinks he is being reasonable. Couldn't I float it just this once? Hadn't I always been good at this? Wasn't I the organized one? And I chose my words carefully because I've learned that pulling the plug is easier when you narrate less, so I told him I would be out of town that weekend and wouldn't be able to coordinate. Then I hung up before the guilt could find a foothold. And it was not an explosion or a fight, just a clean, almost surgical separation of my labor from his celebration, and even though the world did not tilt on its axis, I felt something inside me snap back into place, and that, for me, was revenge that tasted like water after a long run. I didn't attend his party, and when photos eventually surfaced in the group chat with captions about how special and perfect the night had been, I responded with a small heart and then muted the conversation for a month. Which is not dramatic, but feels like putting on noise-canceling headphones while a band you never liked plays in your living room. Later, when my mother praised the spread and mentioned, with a pointed sweetness, how thoughtful it was that someone had stepped up to make everything happen, I looked her in the eye and said it must be nice when people handle their own business, and I watched her study my face as if she were trying to decode whether I meant more than I said, which, of course, I did. I wish I could tell you that one neat act of boundary setting cured the disease of favoritism, but what it did was more practical and, to me, more valuable. It proved that I could stop being the engine hidden under the floorboards of their celebration, that I could decide my labor has a price, and that the price can be no, and after that decision the secrets came easier. I stopped forwarding rental listings to my mother when she hinted that my apartment was too temporary. I stopped copying my brother on emails when he wanted introductions to people I had met through years of work, and I started paying myself back in quiet ways that no one sees, like giving the best parts of my attention to people who remember my birthday without a reminder. If you are wondering whether there was a moment when my mother realized I had begun to extract myself, there was, though she did not name it at the time. It came on a Sunday when she called to ask whether I could handle the dessert order for a family gathering. Because apparently pies require a logistics department, and I told her I would not be attending, not because I was busy, not because of a conflict, but because I didn't want to, and though she tried to laugh it off and suggest I must be teasing, I kept my voice level and repeated myself, and that silence you get right after the word no lands, the silence that feels like a window suddenly opening in a stuffy room, stretched long enough for both of us to hear a new truth assembling itself between us. I ended that call by sending her a link to a small photo album from my housewarming, a handful of pictures, no captions, faces she doesn't know, joy she didn't authorize, and I set the permissions so she could view the thumbnails, but not the locations. Not the full list of names, not the timestamps that would tell her exactly when I moved and how long I kept it to myself, and maybe you'll think that is petty too, but carefully controlling access after a lifetime of being an open pantry felt less like pettiness and more like locking your own front door. She clicked the link, I watched the notifications register as seen, and then I turned off my phone because some boundary decisions deserve an unbroken afternoon. Minutes later, the messages began to arrive, her confusion wrapped in civility, her curiosity wearing its Sunday clothes, her insistence phrased as concern. And I let them collect like leaves against a curb because I wanted her to feel what it is like when the spotlight switches off and you have to sit in the dark with your own questions. And while I was making tea and deciding whether to answer it all, a small alert popped up on my laptop that wasn't from her and wasn't from him, a notification tied to a document they had long forgotten I had access to, and the sight of that name, sitting untouched in a shared folder like an unclaimed suitcase, made me smile because it reminded me that the slope of the floor is not the only design feature in this house, and maybe the ground is about to shift in a way none of them can predict. The thing about keeping a secret as large as a house is that it requires more than silence. It requires a steady performance, a careful orchestration of gestures and omissions that convince everyone watching that nothing has changed. And I discovered that I was better at this than I had ever been at pretending to laugh at my brother's endless stories, because while they believed I was still lingering in an apartment too small for holiday hosting, I was arranging furniture in rooms where the air belonged only to me, where the decisions were mine alone, and where no one's opinion could rewrite the walls I had paid for. It wasn't just about the structure itself. It was about finally having a place that didn't carry the weight of being compared, where every corner wasn't evaluated against what my brother might have chosen, where every meal I cooked wasn't overshadowed by his miraculous ability to grill chicken without burning it, a skill that had somehow elevated him to hero status in my mother's eyes. I remember the first night I slept there, lying on a mattress without a frame because I had not yet moved everything in, listening to the hum of the refrigerator in the next room and realizing that this sound meant ownership. That the soft hum was like a heartbeat reminding me I had chosen something permanent, something stable, something mine, and no matter how my mother might eventually discover it, she could not unsign the papers or diminish the fact that I had carved out a home without her blessing. That realization was not simply comforting, it was intoxicating, because for the first time I felt untouchable, removed from the constant reach of her commentary, free from her inevitable comparisons. When I planned the housewarming, it was with a sense of deliberate rebellion, though no one who attended would have known it. The invitations went out to friends who had cheered me on when I doubted myself, to colleagues who respected me for my work rather than my family name, to neighbors I had only just met who brought bottles of wine with the eagerness of people who wanted connection. I decorated the space with string lights and thrifted vases filled with sunflowers, laid out food that wasn't elaborate but was abundant, and I watched as people filled the rooms with laughter that rose to the ceiling and pressed into every corner. And in that noise I heard what it felt like to belong on my own terms. There was no speech about how much I owed anyone else, no reminder that I had been helped along, no spotlight suddenly redirected to someone else because he had arrived late with a smirk and a story. There was only me, smiling as I poured drinks, knowing every inch of that evening was proof that I was capable of building a life that didn't depend on their recognition. I took photos that night, not hundreds, just enough to hold the memory, and I kept them to myself, resisting the instinct to send even one to my mother, because I knew what would happen if I did. She would study the background, find something to critique, ask questions designed to make me feel smaller, and finally circle back to my brother's grand party as if it were the gold standard against which all celebrations must be measured. By keeping them private, I preserved the joy in its pure form, unsullied by her ability to reduce it to a side note in his story, and every time I opened the album on my phone, I felt a surge of satisfaction that she had been denied the chance to rewrite it. The secrecy wasn't without effort, though. There were times she dropped hints, asking if I was still in that little place and whether it might be time to think about something more permanent, and I would nod or deflect, hearing the implication that permanence could only be achieved under her watchful eye. And each time I chose not to correct her, I felt like I was reclaiming a piece of ground she thought she owned. My brother occasionally asked questions too, usually framed as jokes. Did I need help decorating? Did I know what a mortgage was? And I laughed them off, storing away the irony that while he performed adulthood with family applause, I had quietly surpassed him in ways he didn't even suspect. What struck me most, though, was how easy it became to protect the secret once I tasted the power it gave me. Withholding information felt less like deception and more like justice, like finally balancing scales that had been tilted since childhood, and the beauty of it was that they handed me the perfect cover story with every assumption they made. If they wanted to believe I was behind, struggling, or hesitant, then so be it, because their underestimation was my camouflage, and under that cover I was free to expand without interruption. That is why, when my mother's casual remark about my brother's housewarming slipped across the table, I knew immediately that the secret had served its purpose. It was no longer about keeping something hidden, but about revealing it on my own terms, in a way that left her disarmed and off balance. The look on her face that night, caught between disbelief and the dawning horror that she had missed something monumental, wasn't just satisfying because it reversed the power dynamic for a moment. It was satisfying because it confirmed that she had never been in control of my story, only of the narrative she told herself about it. What she doesn't know, and what no one else in my family has pieced together, is that the housewarming wasn't the only secret I kept, nor was it the most significant. In the process of securing that home, I stumbled across something in the paperwork, something tied to my father's old accounts that had been left dormant for years. Something my mother had perhaps assumed would remain undiscovered because no one else in the family was meticulous enough to notice a line item in a file. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a clerical error waiting to be corrected, but the deeper I dug, the clearer it became that there was more than one kind of inheritance in this family, and not all of it was being accounted for publicly. I haven't confronted her about it yet. The temptation burns sometimes, especially when she slips back into her old patterns of belittling me, but I am holding on to it like a card I am not ready to play. Because the satisfaction of seeing her face drop at the mention of the housewarming was only the beginning, and I know the day will come when she realizes I've been 2 steps ahead of her for far longer than she ever suspected. Until then, I will keep smiling, keep nodding, and keep letting her think she has the upper hand, because nothing unsettles her more than silence, filled with the possibility of secrets she cannot uncover. The shared folder notification that blinked on my screen that afternoon looked innocent, just a software courtesy from a cloud that had hosted every tedious itinerary and casserole sign-up sheet our family ever produced. Yet the file name sitting there like a forgotten suitcase in a quiet station jolted me so hard I had to study my cup on the desk, because it carried my father's name and a date that drifted back to the months after his funeral when everyone was too exhausted to double-check. Anything that didn't cry or leak, and opening it felt like walking into a room where the lights worked, but the furniture had been rearranged in just enough ways to make you stumble. Inside the folder were scanned statements that should have been folded into the binder my mother kept like a badge, the estate. She called it with grandeur, as if paperwork could bless grief, but these pages had slipped through whatever net she used to collect control. And there, in the dry neatness of bank logos and signature lines, was a payable on death designation with my name written not in my father's tidy hand, but as a typed beneficiary line that banks favor because ink is messy and families argue. For a long minute I stared at that beneficiary field and felt heat crawl across my scalp, not because money fixes childhood, not because numbers can apologize, but because proof that I had been seen existed in bureaucratic black and white, tucked into a system my mother had always claimed to understand better than the rest of us. I did not march across town to confront her, and I did not dial my brother to demand explanations about who knew what, because I have learned that revenge wrapped in performance feeds the wrong audience. Instead, I opened a notebook, listed the institution names, searched my files for the death certificate I had scanned years ago because I scan everything, and then I called the bank not as a daughter seeking permission, but as a beneficiary confirming process, and the calm of the woman on the phone steadied me as she explained the steps that any adult could execute: forms to print, identification to bring, a branch visit to finalize, steps that were neither dramatic nor cinematic, yet felt, to me, like sandbags placed along the banks of a river that had flooded for too many seasons. I scheduled the appointment for a weekday morning when my mother would be ferrying her social committee to a crafts market, and I arrived with a folder of documents that made the manager's eyebrows lift with quiet respect, and when the transfer was complete and the account closed, I walked out into a slice of sun that warmed the back of my neck and thought, with a steadiness that surprised me, that this was the shape of justice in a life where speeches never moved the needle. The money itself was not an empire, not a windfall that would buy a coastline, but it was not nothing either, and the concrete weight of it landed in an account with my name and my rules. Which is to say, it became a resource capable of building fences where I wanted fences and doors where I wanted doors, and although I could hear the chorus of opinions from imagined onlookers, people who would argue that a good daughter would share, that a peace-loving sister would announce, that a woman who wanted healing would invite negotiation, I chose to silence them with the memory of 1,000 smaller thefts that had never been acknowledged. Like the hours I spent booking flights I did not take or the weekends lost to errands for events that could proceed without me. And I decided that my father's quiet administrative blessing would not be converted into one more subsidy for a hierarchy that had cemented itself in our kitchen decades ago. I did not buy anything flashy, did not paint a wall or drive a different car, because I did not want the satisfaction cheapened by spectacle. Instead, I created a small trust with the help of a lawyer whose office smelled like wood polish and soft authority. A man who listened without prying and drew up papers that placed my house and the beneficiary proceeds under a structure my mother would not be able to access in the event of one of her grand reorganizations of my life, and signing those documents produced a sensation I can only describe as the opposite of drowning, a long breath that fills parts of your lungs you forget exist when you have been treading water for too long. Then, because I promised myself a clear, restrained sequence, I wrote an email that was polite enough to survive screenshotting yet firm enough to redraw a map, telling my mother that I would no longer be able to coordinate or fund family events, that I wished them lovely times full of laughter, and that I looked forward to seeing everyone when schedules aligned at gatherings I did not produce, and I pressed send without trembling because I had already built the wall that would keep me from running back to patch holes when someone discovered we had run out of serving spoons. The response came as a series of messages that read like weather patterns, first brisk and breezy as she pretended to misunderstand, then humid with exasperation as she attempted to recast my boundaries as a phase, and finally thunderous in their insinuations that I was being ungrateful, vindictive, dramatic, and, while part of me registered the familiar pull to defend, explain, soften another part, the part that had watched a teller print my name on a confirmation slip, remained serene, so I replied once, with a sentence that did not invite a debate, and let the rest sit unread while I cooked dinner in a kitchen that existed precisely because I had learned to separate my life from her management of it. Days later, the practical ripples began to show in places she valued, because that is how consequence travels, and though I felt no joy in the small messes that proliferated when I stopped being the invisible scaffolding, missed rental deposits for the hall that hosted her social club, a florist who could not find the original order, a painter who refused to extend a discount to a friend of a friend with no contract, I also felt no obligation to step in, since obligation without reciprocity is just a leash with a pleasanter name. My brother called in the tone he uses when he thinks he is a diplomat, offering to smooth things over if I would just talk to Mom and perhaps agree to handle the big stuff this once. And I listened without interrupting because interruptions only feed him material, then told him I hoped his next party was wonderful and that I would arrive as a guest, not as staff, and when he laughed the way people laugh at a line that doesn't land, I quietly mentioned that the accounts related to our father had been reconciled, that the bank had closed the one everyone forgot, and that any future questions about that matter should be directed to me or, better yet, to the manager whose card I would be happy to share. And there was a pause long enough to confirm that information had struck bone, after which he muttered that Mom would be upset, and I said, without warmth or malice, that grown people manage their own emotions. Revenge, if we must call it that, arrived not as a crash, but as a recalibration, a shift in gravity that made their steps wobble the way mine had wobbled for years. And the proof that the axis had turned came not in an apology or an admission, but in a piece of mail addressed to me that had once been routed to my mother. The safe deposit box billing notice with both our names and a key number that I recognized as the tiny brass shape that had lived, neglected, in a velvet pouch at the back of my dresser since the week we emptied my father's desk, I held the notice under the kitchen light and understood, with the sort of clarity that lands like a bell, that the next move would not be an email or a refusal to fund a tray of sandwiches, but a visit to a quiet bank room where steel and silence meet, where histories are kept in envelopes, and where whatever my father meant to leave in the dark might finally see daylight. And I realized, in the same breath, that I would not be walking into that vault alone. The bank lobby smelled faintly of polished metal and paper dust, a quiet that made every footstep feel like a decision, and as I signed the register for the safe deposit room with the even, deliberate handwriting I reserve for moments that cannot be walked back, I felt the familiar mix of steadiness and ache that has accompanied every step of this long extraction, because taking control of your own life is never just a posture or a line, it is a sequence of unglamorous acts that add up to something undeniable, and today that something included a brass key I had kept tucked away for years and a knowledge that whatever waited behind steel would not only clarify the past, but also draft the outline of whatever came next. The attendant led me through the corridor where time seems to slow into its component parts, and my mother, who had insisted on coming after a phone call from my brother rebranded as concern what was clearly panic, walked beside me with a face that pretended neutrality, while her fingers worried the strap of her handbag, and although she greeted the attendant as if the whole matter were routine, I watched the quick rise and fall in her throat and understood that the story she had told herself about control was developing cracks she could no longer disguise with tone. When the drawer slid forward with that gentle, careful clink and the lid lifted under my hand, the light caught the edges of folders and a small envelope that had yellowed just enough to say it had been here a long time, and the part of me that still loves ritual, forms, dates, signatures, took a breath and opened the envelope first, because envelopes carry intention, and in it I found a letter in my father's dry, precise script that began with my name and moved in sentences that sounded exactly like him, sentences that did not apologize for history or beg for understanding, but simply described facts as he understood them, including the fact that he had watched the way the family current carried me to the edges while my brother floated on the warm, buoyant center, and that he had chosen to place a portion of what he could control where I might reach it without gatekeeping or permission, because fairness, as he wrote in a line that tightened my chest, is not always symmetry but sometimes correction. The letter referenced the payable on death account I had already closed and then mentioned documents in the blue folder, which turned out to be a set of beneficiary forms and a small life policy, modest but real, in my name alone, with a note that he had purchased it late and meant it as ballast, not as a prize, and tucked beneath those papers was a deed copy for a parcel of land out of state that I had never heard discussed, a skinny rectangle along a river with a zoning designation that made my mother exhale in a sharp, involuntary sound she tried to swallow, and in that moment the line between surprise and recognition in her eyes told me that she had not known everything, not even close. I did not raise my voice or perform discovery for the benefit of the room, because revenge that relies on spectators becomes theater, and I have no interest in theater, so I read the letter again, slower. Let the words land in all the places that had been bruised for years, then closed the envelope with a palm that did not shake and placed it in my bag, and only then did I look at my mother, who had collected herself enough to adopt the tone she reserves for reclassifying other people's belongings as family assets, and I cut her off with a sentence as gentle as a blade: "These are mine under law and under intent, and the bank has already verified it, and we will not be litigating feelings in this room." And the quiet that followed did not feel like victory so much as oxygen, the first deep breath after someone has been pressing their thumb to your sternum for so long you forgot air could come without permission. She said my father did not mean to divide us, and I said he meant to correct what had been bent, and I watched the understanding move across her face that my days of underwriting the family pageant were over, not because I had turned cruel, but because I had finally turned precise, which to her reads like cruelty, because anything that is not service reads like betrayal. Outside, the afternoon had that late-day glow that makes even parking lots look cinematic, and, while she marched ahead to the car with the stiff dignity of a person rehearsing a statement for later, I lingered on the sidewalk and texted the lawyer whose card I had been carrying for weeks, asking for a brief meeting to add the policy and the parcel to the trust, because the cleanest revenge is not a scene but a system, and I have been building one patiently. Quietly, one brick at a time. When I arrived home, I placed my father's letter on the kitchen counter under the soft cone of the pendant light, poured water into a glass like it was a ceremony, and let the stillness unspool until the phone began to vibrate with the predictable sequence. My brother offering to mediate, my mother suggesting a family talk, an aunt forwarding a prayer as if scripture could erase a beneficiary designation, and I silenced the notifications, then forwarded a single scanned page to my mother, not the letter. Only the line where my name appears next to the words payable on death, accompanied by a concise note that said I would be attending future gatherings as a guest, that financial responsibilities henceforth would be owned by those who plan the parties and reap the praise, and that I hoped her next holiday was full of the laughter she loves, because sometimes the most exact statement of revenge is a boundary written in sentences that cannot be rephrased. I wish I could say this ending arrives with neat forgiveness or a door slamming forever, but the truth is less tidy and more human, which is the only way it can matter. I have not disowned my mother, and she has not learned to love me the way I needed. And between those realities lies a life I can live without shrinking, a house I chose, a ledger I manage, a trust that holds its shape, and a letter that proves at least one person saw me clearly when it counted. At dinner that night, I set one extra plate on the table and then put it back in the cabinet, not because I expected a ghost to sit with me, but because rituals matter when you are building something out of the scraps you were given. And as the porch light clicked on and the yard settled into the hum that tells you are home, I understood that ambiguity is not a failure here. It is a space I am finally allowed to occupy, one where my mother may or may not step toward me differently. One where my brother may or may not understand that applause is not ownership, and one where I get to decide, episode by episode, whether silence is a shield or an answer, which is the kind of revenge that does not glitter but endures.